The corridor of Fort Raven's main operations wing buzzed with the static hum of urgency radios squawking, boots hammering, officers cutting through the noise with clipped orders. Fluorescent lights flickered above, casting sharp white stripes over steel and fatigue. The air smelled faintly of coffee, metal, and tension, the scent of sleepless men and women who lived on adrenaline and silence. Sergeant Miles Kerr moved fast, too fast. His jaw was tight, his thoughts burning like coals behind his eyes. The failed night exercise still stung, a single misfire, a missed signal, and now his unit was on standby until further notice. The humiliation crawled under his skin. He'd spent years earning his stripes, his authority, and tonight one mistake had made him look reckless. He turned the corner hard, eyes on the ground, steps loud enough to echo. Then came the collision, solid, unexpected. A brief flash of movement, a soft gasp, and a stack of files scattered across the polished floor. Miles barely registered the woman's presence before his frustration boiled over. "Watch where you're going, ma'am," he snapped, his voice cutting through the corridor like a whip. His hand came up, pushing her shoulder to clear his path, not a strike, but sharp enough to send her back against the wall with a dull thud. The sound wasn't loud, but it carried. The kind of sound that draws attention in a place where rank means everything. For a split second, the entire hallway froze. A pair of officers paused mid-conversation. Two recruits halted at the corner, eyes wide. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with disbelief. Miles exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. "Look, I didn't mean—" Then he heard the voice, deep, commanding, and cutting through the air like a blade. "Sergeant Kerr." He turned, stomach sinking. Standing at the far end of the corridor was Colonel Anders, base commander, his expression unreadable. His tone was quiet, but it carried the weight of decades in uniform. "You just assaulted your new commanding officer." The words landed like a grenade. The woman straightened from the wall. She was smaller than he expected, barely reaching his shoulder, but when she met his eyes, the corridor seemed to narrow around them. Her gaze was level, steady, a cold ocean under sunlight. There was no anger in her face, no fear either, just clarity. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she smoothed the sleeve of her light gray jacket, gathered the scattered files from the floor, and adjusted the strap of her bag with precise, unhurried movements. Her voice, when it came, was calm, quiet enough that everyone had to lean in slightly to hear. "Report to my office in 10 minutes, Sergeant. Don't be late." She turned and walked past the stunned silence, her steps even, deliberate. No fury, no dramatics. Just command, the kind that doesn't need to raise its voice to be obeyed. The colonel's eyes stayed on Miles. "You'll want to start praying she's more forgiving than I would be," he muttered, before following after her. Miles stood there, frozen. The world around him began to move again. Whispers spreading down the hall, boots shifting, papers rustling. Someone exhaled sharply. Someone else muttered, "That's Admiral Vance?" The name hit like a slap. Miles turned sharply, the echo of it ringing in his ears. Admiral Leora Vance. He knew the name, everyone did, the youngest admiral in fleet history. The woman who'd led the Arctic siege extraction when 2 divisions were trapped under enemy radar. The one who'd disappeared afterward for reasons sealed under classified code. And he had just shoved her against a wall. He swallowed hard, the weight of his own breath suddenly heavy. His pulse thudded against his throat. Down the hall, her retreating figure didn't once turn back. She didn't need to. Her silence had already written the rest of the story. 10 minutes. He looked at the clock on the wall. The seconds seemed to move slower now, each one hammering home what he'd done. The kind of mistake you don't live down, not because of punishment, but because of who you'd underestimated. He straightened his uniform, his reflection sharp in the glass panel of a closed door. Somewhere inside, a voice muttered the truth he couldn't yet say aloud. He hadn't just disrespected a superior. He'd just shoved a legend. The hallway outside Admiral Vance's office was so still that even the hum of the fluorescent lights sounded loud. Miles sat rigid on the narrow metal bench, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tight enough that his knuckles had turned pale. Across from him, a framed photograph of the Fleet Command stared back, smiling officers in full dress, rows of medals catching the sunlight. He recognized her face among them, though barely. Younger, sharper, before the stories. The air in the corridor was cold, antiseptic. Every passing officer cast him the same fleeting glance. Curiosity, recognition, quiet amusement. The kind reserved for men who'd already written their own downfall. Miles adjusted his uniform for the fourth time, tugged at the collar as if the fabric itself were choking him. He'd been in combat zones with less tension than this. Inside the office, muffled sounds of movement, a drawer opening, the faint rustle of papers. He imagined her behind that door, reading through his file. Every commendation, every reprimand. Every red mark that hinted at the same flaw, temper. It had earned him respect among grunts, irritation among officers, and now, possibly, an early grave for his career. Rumors swirled like smoke through his mind. Admiral Leora Vance, the ghost of the Arctic siege. The woman who'd led 2 battalions through a storm so brutal the wind itself was said to cut skin. The operative who went missing for 3 years, reappearing with a chest full of ribbons and a silence no one dared question. Some said she'd been captured, others whispered she'd volunteered for something darker. Classified missions with no survivors. A soft buzz sounded from the intercom. Send him in. Miles rose. His boots felt heavier with each step. The door opened with a slow hiss, revealing an office stripped of vanity metal desk, 2 chairs, a shelf lined with neatly labeled files. No awards, no photographs, just efficiency. The Admiral sat behind the desk, sleeves rolled halfway, reading glasses perched low on her nose. "Sergeant Kerr," she said without looking up. "Close the door." The words were calm, not unkind, but carried the weight of an order impossible to ignore. He obeyed, the latch clicking like a gavel. She flipped through the folder in her hands. 8 years of service, infantry, tactical response, commended twice for bravery under fire, once reprimanded for disobedience. Her tone remained even. And last night, you decided to add assaulting a superior officer to that record. "Ma'am, I don't." She looked up now. Her eyes were sharp, a pale gray that saw too much. "Excuses are noise. I deal in facts." He fell silent. "You're good, Kerr," she continued, setting the file down. "Too good to hide behind anger. But you lack control. And control is what keeps soldiers alive. It's what separates command from chaos." He tried to meet her gaze, but couldn't hold it for long. There was something disarming about her calm, something that stripped him bare faster than any shouting ever could. "Tell me," she said after a pause, "why did you shove me?" He swallowed. "I wasn't thinking, Admiral. I—" "You were thinking," she interrupted softly. "You were thinking of yourself. That's the problem. You mistake frustration for focus, and frustration gets people killed." The words hit harder than he expected. They weren't cruel, but they cut with precision. She leaned back slightly, studying him the way a surgeon studies a wound. He braced for the reprimand, for the suspension, the reassignment, the paperwork that would end his climb. Instead, she picked up a pen, signed a document, and slid it across the desk. "Effective immediately," she said. "You're reassigned to my tactical unit." He blinked. "Ma'am?" "You'll report to the hangar at 0500. You'll train under my direct supervision until I decide you're either ready or hopeless." It didn't sound like mercy, but it didn't sound like punishment either. It sounded like a sentence, a lesson disguised as opportunity. "I don't understand," he said quietly. "I know," she replied. "That's why you're here." For a long moment, neither moved. The clock ticked softly in the background, each second pulling the air tighter. Finally, she looked back to the folder. "Dismissed, Sergeant." He saluted, stiff and automatic, then turned toward the door. His reflection caught in the glass as he left, shoulders squared, face pale. Outside, the corridor felt even colder than before. He leaned against the wall, breathing shallowly. He should have felt relief, but all he felt was confusion. Her composure lingered in his mind, the way she hadn't raised her voice, hadn't demanded an apology, hadn't tried to humiliate him. No anger, no satisfaction, just understanding. It unnerved him more than any punishment could have, because beneath that calm, beneath that surgical precision, he sensed something deeper, something earned through pain, through years of silence and survival. And for the first time in his career, Miles Kerr didn't fear the consequences. He feared the lesson. The days blurred into one another: drills, strategy sessions, silent evaluations under the Admiral's unyielding gaze. Miles learned quickly that working under Admiral Vance was like operating beneath a microscope. Every flaw magnified, every hesitation exposed. She didn't need to shout to command obedience. Her presence alone bent the air around her. When she entered a room, conversations dropped an octave. Orders didn't echo, they landed, final and sharp. The first week, she said little to him. Her instructions came clipped and direct, no room for interpretation. Correct your stance. Adjust your line of fire. You're thinking too loudly. The last one, he never quite understood, but somehow, he started doing better after she said it. It wasn't until the second week that he realized she was teaching him in layers: discipline first, then patience, then intuition. She was building something out of him, brick by reluctant brick. She was unrelenting but never cruel. She never sought to break him down, only to sharpen what was already there. When his temper flared, when exhaustion or pride pushed too far, she met his defiance with silence that felt heavier than anger. That silence forced him to see himself, and he hated that it worked. By the third week, he'd learned her rhythm, the way she tapped her pen twice before giving a new command. The way she paused just long enough before saying, "Proceed," as if measuring whether the person across from her deserved the chance. He started anticipating her movements, her methods. And somewhere in that rhythm, respect began to replace resentment. One evening, she called him into the briefing chamber. The war room was dim, lit only by the cold glow of satellite projections across the central table. Maps scrolled under flickering coordinates, regions highlighted in red. Her team was already there, officers from multiple divisions, their faces drawn with fatigue and focus. At 0300 yesterday, she began. We lost contact with Recon Unit Vega 9 near the northern border. Terrain interference, possibly hostile interference. Satellite feed confirms debris, but no thermal signatures. We have 12 missing. Her tone was clinical, but the silence that followed wasn't. The air tightened with the weight of 12 lives hanging in the unknown. Miles leaned forward, scanning the maps. Permission to ask, ma'am, are we extraction or recovery? Her eyes flicked toward him, gray and unreadable. We don't use the word recovery until there's proof. He nodded, chastened. She zoomed in on the last known coordinates. They were last seen near Ridgepoint, heavy forest, no comms, no drones in range. It's a dead zone. As she moved her hand over the display, Miles caught a glimpse of her wrist barely visible beneath her rolled sleeve. Small circular scars, like faded burns. They weren't random, uniform, intentional. The kind that came from something designed to break people slowly. She noticed his gaze, but didn't hide them. Instead, she rested her hand flat against the table. We don't leave anyone behind, she said quietly. Ever again. The room went still. No one dared ask what she meant by times again, asterisk. Her voice softened, but it carried something raw, an ache buried so deep it became steel. This team will operate under blackout conditions. No contact, no backup until extraction. We move fast, we move clean, and we move together. The officers nodded. Miles did too, though his mind lingered on her words, the kind that weren't written in any handbook, the kind forged by loss. When the meeting ended, the others filed out in silence. Miles lingered near the door. He wanted to say something, though he didn't know what. Maybe an apology, maybe gratitude. She noticed. You have a question, Sergeant. He shook his head. Just wondering why you chose me for this unit. She regarded him for a long moment, then said, because people who make mistakes remember them longer than those who don't. He didn't answer. She turned back to the projection, the faint light outlining the scars on her wrist again. They weren't just reminders, they were promises. As he stepped out into the corridor, he understood something that had eluded him since that first day in the hallway. The woman he'd shoved wasn't just a superior, she wasn't even just a survivor. She was a legend walking in silence, someone who'd seen what hell looked like and came back carrying the names of those who hadn't. And whether he was ready or not, he was now part of her story. The sky was a hard, colorless gray that morning, one of those skies that pressed low against the earth, muting everything beneath it. The convoy rolled slow through the narrow pass, tires crunching over frost-bitten soil, engines rumbling in rhythm with the heartbeat of the mission. Miles sat in the second transport, eyes scanning the ridges. The world was too quiet. He'd been in enough operations to know silence was never mercy. It was the sound before something broke. Admiral Vance rode in the lead vehicle, window down just enough for the cold to slip in. She didn't fidget, didn't pace, didn't even speak. Her gaze was fixed ahead, reading the terrain like scripture. The rest of the team followed her lead. She was calm, and so they were calm. That was how it always went with her. They were 10 minutes from the last known coordinates of Vega 9 when the first explosion hit. The world erupted in dust and sound, metal twisting, glass shattering, the deafening roar of an IED detonating beneath the road. Miles was thrown against the side door, the breath ripped from his chest. Ambush, someone shouted. Gunfire poured from the ridgeline above, sharp and unrelenting. Miles scrambled to his knees, grabbing his rifle as bullets chewed through the convoy. He saw Vance's vehicle veer sideways, tires blown out, smoke rising from the hood. Without thinking, he leapt out of cover and ran. The air was a storm of lead and grit, tracer rounds streaking through the fog. He reached her just as another burst of fire tore through the air. She was already out of the vehicle, pistol drawn, her expression carved from stone. Get back, she barked, but he ignored her, diving to cover her flank as a line of fire erupted from the left ridge. He caught the glint of a rifle scope, raised his weapon, and fired. The recoil kicked hard against his shoulder. The target dropped, but not before a round punched through his side. He stumbled, knees buckling. Vance caught him before he hit the ground, her arm looped under his, dragging him behind a fallen transport. Bullets struck metal inches above their heads. She moved like she'd done it 1,000 times, measured, precise, her pistol barking in 3 steady shots that silenced the gunner on the ridge. When the chaos finally ebbed, the valley was filled with smoke and silence. The only sound left was the wind, and the ragged breaths coming from Miles as he stared up at the pale sky. The pain was sharp but distant, his mind hazy with adrenaline and disbelief. Vance crouched beside him, her gloved hand pressing against the wound, blood seeping through her fingers. Her face hovered above his, those same gray eyes that had met his anger weeks ago, now filled with something quieter. I'm sorry, he whispered, voice barely audible over the ringing in his ears. She didn't look away. Don't apologize, she said softly. Learn. The words cut through the noise, simple and final. He felt them more than he heard them. Then everything faded into white. When Miles opened his eyes again, it was weeks later. The sterile hum of the medical wing replaced the battlefield's roar. He healed slowly, physically first, then something deeper. Every soldier who came to check on him had the same look in their eyes. Respect. Not pity, not gossip. Respect. By the time he was cleared for duty, the story had already spread. How he'd thrown himself into the line of fire for her. How she'd saved his life with her own hands. But no one mentioned the shove anymore. It had become something else, part of the myth of Admiral Vance, the woman who taught with silence, and the sergeant who finally learned to listen. The day of the debrief, he stood in the main hall, uniform pressed, boots gleaming. The Admiral entered with her usual calm, her stride even, her expression unreadable. Every officer in the room straightened at once. Miles snapped to attention. "Admiral," he said, voice steady. She met his gaze for a fraction of a second, and returned his salute precise, unhurried. No words passed between them, none were needed. When she turned to address the room, her tone carried the same quiet authority that had once frozen a corridor full of men. But to Miles, it carried something else: recognition, maybe even forgiveness. Outside, the sun had begun to break through the clouds, pale light spilling across the tarmac. Miles watched her walk away, her figure framed against the glow, and he understood what had changed. Some lessons weren't taught in classrooms or combat drills. Some were learned in silence, paid for with blood, humility, and the realization that leadership wasn't about fear, it was about steadiness in the storm. And though no one ever spoke of the shove again, every soldier on that base knew the story. Not of disgrace or anger, but of transformation, of a man who learned respect, and of a woman who led with it.